The first time Trent Ashford-Whitmore looked out his bay window and saw 400 old men standing in the street, he was holding a coffee mug worth more than most of their pensions. He didn't drop it, he just stared. The mug stayed in his hand even as his fingers went white, even as the first row of those old men, gray-haired, broad-shouldered, some leaning on canes, some standing at attention like the years had never touched them, turned their heads in unison and looked straight at his front door. There were Marines in the front, then Army, then Navy, then Air Force. Some wore old dress blues that no longer quite fit. Some wore faded leather jackets stitched with unit patches. One man near the curb wore a chest full of ribbons and a purple heart that caught the morning sun. Behind them, parked along both sides of Maple Hollow Lane, were over 200 vehicles, pickup trucks, sedans, 2 charter buses, 1 old Harley with a sidecar, and a 1972 Cadillac with a folded American flag laid carefully across the dashboard. Not one of them said a word. And in the middle of his own front yard, where Trent's 6-foot privacy fence used to stand, the fence he had paid a contractor $12,000 to install just so he wouldn't have to look at the old man next door, there was now nothing but a pile of splintered cedar and an 87-year-old Korean War veteran named Walter Brennan, standing in the grass, hands folded behind his back. Walt wasn't smiling. He was just waiting. Let me tell you about Cedar Hollow. It was the kind of town that didn't make the news. Tucked into the rolling green hills of southern Missouri, about 40 minutes outside Springfield, Cedar Hollow had a population of just under 4,000 people, 1 stoplight, 2 diners, and a Veterans of Foreign Wars Hall that had been built in 1947. In the summer of 2018, the maple trees along Maple Hollow Lane had grown tall enough to shade the whole street. Sprinklers ticked across well-kept lawns in the early mornings. The smell of cut grass and bacon drifted through the screen doors. American flags hung from porches, not because anyone was making a statement, but because that's just what people did in Cedar Hollow. It was the kind of place where the mailman knew your dog by name. The kind of place where a man could sit on his front porch in a worn leather recliner, drink black coffee from a chipped Marine Corps mug, and feel, for the first time in a long time, that the world was at peace. That man was Walter Brennan. Master Sergeant Walter J. Brennan, United States Marine Corps, retired. Born November 14, 1930 in St. Joseph, Missouri. Enlisted at the age of 19 in October of 1950, 4 months into a war that most Americans, even today, struggle to remember. Walt didn't serve in World War II. He didn't serve in Vietnam, not directly. He served in Korea, the so-called Forgotten War, and he served there during the worst winter American forces had faced since Valley Forge. He was at the Chasin Reservoir. If you don't know what that means, it means this. In November of 1950, in temperatures that fell to 35 degrees below zero, a force of 15,000 United Nations troops, mostly U.S. Marines, were surrounded by over 120,000 Chinese soldiers. They fought their way out, 17 days of frozen hell. Walt was a corporal at the time. He came home with frostbite that took 2 of his toes, a bronze star with V for valor, and memories he never spoke of, not once in 70 years. Then he stayed in 22 more years of service, drill instructor at Paris Island, advisor in Vietnam in 1968, quiet logistics work in Germany, retired in 1972 as a master sergeant with a chest full of ribbons he kept in a wooden box under his bed. He came home to Cedar Hollow. He married his high school sweetheart, Margaret Maggie Brennan, in 1973. They built a small white house at 412 Maple Hollow Lane, 2 stories, front porch, a flagpole in the yard, planted in concrete by Walt's own hands the week he moved in. They raised 1 son who became a high school history teacher in Kansas City and called every Sunday at 6 p.m. Maggie passed in 2014, pancreatic cancer. Quick, Walt didn't cry at the funeral. He cried later alone on the porch with the flag snapping in the wind above him. Now he was 87 years old. His hair was white, his back was a little bent. His left hand shook sometimes when he poured his coffee. He had an old golden retriever named Duke who slept by his feet and a notebook by the phone, a leather-bound notebook, brown, soft as a glove, that he had carried since 1953. Inside that notebook were the names, addresses, and phone numbers of every Marine he had ever served beside. Some of those names had a small black cross next to them now, most of them. But not all. The truck arrived on a Saturday morning in April of 2018. It was a 40-foot moving van, bright white, with the name of a Kansas City logistics company on the side. Behind it came a black 2018 Range Rover Autobiography, gleaming so brightly it looked wet. Behind that came a silver BMW X7. Behind that came a small sedan carrying what would later be revealed as the family's interior decorator. The man who stepped out of the Range Rover was 38 years old. His name was Trent Ashford-Whitmore. He stood 5'10" in his Italian loafers, wore a tailored navy quarter-zip pullover, had a Tag Heuer watch on his left wrist, and held a phone to his ear with the kind of expression that suggested whoever was on the other end was beneath him. He was a partner at a high-end mergers and acquisitions law firm in Kansas City. He had a master's degree from Wharton. His wife, Brittany, was an influencer with a following of 41,000 on Instagram. They had 2 children, ages 8 and 10, who would soon be enrolled in a private school 40 minutes away. The Ashford-Whitmores had purchased the house at 410 Maple Hollow Lane, the property next to Walt's, for $840,000. They planned, they told the realtor, to modernize the entire street by example. The first thing Trent did was park his Range Rover halfway across the property line, blocking part of Walt's driveway. The second thing he did when Walt walked over politely to introduce himself with a plate of his late wife's famous lemon bars was look the old man up and down, boots, jeans, faded Marine Corps cap, and say, "Yeah, no thanks, we don't really eat that kind of food." Then he walked back inside. The screen door slammed. Walt stood there for a moment in the bright April sun, holding the plate, the lemon bars trembling slightly in his shaking left hand. Then he turned, walked home, and gave the lemon bars to Duke. 3 weeks later, Trent knocked on Walt's door for the first and only time. It was a Tuesday just past 6 in the evening. The sky was the color of orange sherbet. Walt opened the door in his slippers with Duke at his side and found Trent standing on the porch holding a piece of paper. "You need to take that down," Trent said, pointing past Walt's shoulder. Walt turned slightly, looked at his flagpole, looked back. "My flag." "The pole," Trent said, "it's an eyesore. Brittany can see it from our master bedroom. We bought this house for the privacy and the view, and there's a giant pole in the way. Pole comes down or we go to court." He held up the paper. It was a printout from his law firm's letterhead, threatening, lawyerly, full of words like easement violation and aesthetic nuisance and diminution of property value. Most of it was nonsense, but the threat was real. Walt looked at the paper, then up at Trent. His voice, when it came out, was the same voice he had used for 50 years to give orders to 19-year-old Marines. Quiet, even, no edge at all. "Son, that flag has flown over this yard since 1973. It's on my property. The pole is in concrete I poured myself. I don't believe there's a court in Missouri that's going to make me take it down." "You'd be surprised what money can do, old man," Trent said. He turned to leave, then he stopped at the porch step. "And honestly," he said without looking back, "listen, this isn't your little army base anymore. Nobody in this neighborhood salutes you. Nobody cares about your war. Take the pole down or I'll bury you in legal fees, your choice." Then he walked away. The screen door creaked shut behind Walt. He stood there for a long time, the smell of his neighbor's expensive cologne still hanging in the warm spring air. Duke pressed against his leg. "Direct hit. Now let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever tried to be reasonable with someone who has no interest in being reasonable? Someone who mistook your kindness for weakness, your patience for permission? If you have, and I think most of you have, drop a comment below and tell me what happened. I read every single one, because I have a feeling by the end of this story you're going to want to share it. Now back to Walt. You see, folks, some men, when they get insulted, they explode. They yell, they throw punches, they escalate. But that's not how Marines from the Chasin Reservoir handle problems. What they do is this: they get quiet, they start watching, they take notes. That night, Walt walked into his garage and pulled down a cardboard box from a high shelf. Inside the box was a brand new outdoor security camera system his son had given him for Christmas the year before. 4K cameras Walt had never bothered to install. He spent the next 2 days mounting them, one on the front porch, one above the garage, one on the back fence overlooking the property line, and one, the smallest one, hidden behind a hanging fern, pointed directly at the base of the flagpole. He started a notebook different from the leather one. This one was a yellow legal pad, date, time, incident. Over the next 90 days, the entries piled up. May 4, trash bag thrown over fence into Rose bed, photographed. May 11, Range Rover deliberately parked across driveway entrance for 47 minutes, plate noted. May 19, HOA complaint received. Note, there is no HOA in Cedar Hollow. May 22, anonymous noise complaint filed with the Cedar Hollow Sheriff. Officer Daniels responded, apologized, said it was the third one that month. June 3, mailbox struck by Range Rover. Driver did not stop. Footage saved. June 14, Brittany Ashford-Whitmore filmed Walt watering his roses and posted it to her Instagram with the caption, "Boomer neighbors who refuse to modernize face with rolling eyes." Footage saved. June 27, Duke found in front yard with a small cut on his back leg, possibly from broken glass thrown over fence. Vet bill, $147. July 2, anonymous complaint filed with Veterans Affairs alleging Walt was stolen valor. Complaint dismissed within 48 hours when his DD-214 was confirmed. July 9, Trent's contractor began building a 6-foot privacy fence directly on the property line. Surveyor confirmed fence is approximately 14 inches over onto Walt's land. Walt did not object. Yet. July 18, Brittany screamed at Walt in front of her children for staring at her while she was on her patio. Walt was, in fact, watering tomatoes. Footage saved. Through all of it, every insult, every petty cruelty, every legal threat, Walt did not raise his voice. He did not call a lawyer. He did not even mention it to his son on their Sunday phone calls. He just made coffee. He fed Duke. He raised the flag every morning at sunrise, and he lowered it every evening at sunset, the same way he had done for 45 years. Direct hit. And let me ask you another question, friends. How many of you have a parent or a grandparent like Walt, someone who has seen the worst the world has to offer, who came home and built a quiet life, who never asks for anything and never makes a fuss? Tell me about them in the comments. I want to know their names, because Walt is about to remind you why men like that built this country. He was waiting. A Marine, you see, knows the difference between fighting and winning. Fighting is loud, winning is quiet. It happened on a Sunday. July 29, 2018. The morning was unusually still, the kind of summer morning where the cicadas haven't started yet and you can hear a single screen door slam from 3 blocks away. The sky was a pale, washed-out blue. The temperature was already pushing 85 at 8 in the morning. Walt had gone to early service at First Baptist Church of Cedar Hollow, the way he had every Sunday since 1973. He left the house at 7:40. He told Duke he'd be back by 9:30. He came back at 9:27. He pulled his old Ford F-150 into the driveway. He turned off the engine. He sat there for a moment, the way old men sometimes do, just looking through the windshield. Then he saw it. The flagpole was still standing. Walt had built it well. 50 years of Missouri storms hadn't moved that pole 1 inch. But the flag was on the ground. Cut down. The American flag, the one Maggie had hand-stitched a new edge on in 1989 after the original one wore through, the one Walt raised every single morning of his life since the Nixon administration, the one that had flown over the funerals of 2 presidents he had voted for and 2 he had not, was lying in a heap on the grass. The rope had been cut clean. The flag was crumpled, half on the grass, half in a puddle of muddy water from the morning sprinklers. And in the middle of it, boot prints, big ones, Trent's golf shoe spikes as it would later turn out. Walt got out of the truck. He moved slowly. He walked across the yard. He bent down, and at his age, this was not easy, and he picked up the flag with both hands. He folded it. right there in the yard. 13 folds, the way he had been taught in 1950. The way he had folded a flag for fallen Marines 123 times in his career. He held the triangle of red, white, and blue against his chest. Then he turned and looked toward Trent's house. Trent was watching from the upstairs window, smiling. Walt nodded once. Then he walked into his house. He set the flag, folded, on the dining room table where Maggie used to set the Sunday roast. He walked over to the wall where his rotary phone still hung, even in 2018, because he had never seen the point of changing it. He picked up the leather notebook from the shelf below the phone. He opened to the first page. Direct hit now if you think Walt Brennan is going to let this go, if you think a man who survived 17 days at 35 below zero, surrounded by 120,000 enemy soldiers, is going to roll over because some lawyer in Italian loafers cut down his flag, then folks, let me tell you something. You have never met a man like Walt Brennan. And neither has Trent Ashford-Whitmore. Here's what nobody knew at the time. That leather notebook in Walt's hand was not just a list of old friends. It was a roster. The 1st Marine Division, 7th Marine Regiment, 2nd Battalion, F Company. The men who had fought beside Walt at the Chasen Reservoir. The men who had carried each other through frozen mountain passes while their fingers turned black. The men who had buried friends in ground too hard to dig. Of the original 187 men in F Company who deployed to Korea, 38 came home. As of July 2018, only 9 of those 38 were still alive. But Walt's notebook didn't stop at F Company. Over the years it had grown. There were the Marines he had trained at Paris Island, thousands of them, many now grandfathers, some now generals. There were the Marines he had served with in Vietnam, the boys he had advised who had come home and joined the veterans of foreign wars, the American Legion, the Marine Corps League. And then there was the most important phone number in the entire notebook. A name on the very first page, written in pencil, faded with time, but never crossed out. Patrick Paddy Doyle. Master Sergeant, United States Marine Corps, retired. Walt's best friend since the second day of boot camp in 1950. The man who had carried Walt down a mountain at Chasen when Walt's frostbitten foot gave out. The man who had been Walt's best man at his wedding. The man whose own son James Doyle had grown up to become, and this is where it gets interesting, a senior board member of the Veterans of Foreign Wars and a personal friend of half the VFW post commanders in the Midwest. You see, folks, what Trent Ashford-Whitmore did not understand, what people like Trent never understand, is that Marines do not stop being Marines. Ever. And Marines have a phrase, maybe you've heard it. Semper Fidelis, always faithful. It's not a slogan, it's not a marketing line, it's not something you hang on a coffee mug. It is a promise. A promise that says, if you are one of us and you are in trouble anywhere in this country, we will come. Walt picked up the phone. He dialed Paddy Doyle's number from memory. The phone rang twice. A gravelly voice, thick with Boston, picked up on the other end. Walt, you old goat, you haven't called me in 18 months, somebody die. Walt didn't smile, he just closed his eyes for a second. The way old soldiers do when they're about to ask something they don't want to ask. Paddy, he said quietly, I need a favor. There was a pause on the other end of the line, the kind of pause that only happens between two men who have known each other for 68 years. What kind of favor? Walt told him. Paddy listened, he didn't interrupt. When Walt was done, there was another long pause, and then Paddy said 3 words. How many do you need? Walt said, I just thought maybe a few of the boys would want to come stand on the porch with me. Paddy laughed, it was not a kind laugh. Walter, he said, you give me 48 hours. I'll bring you the entire United States Marine Corps if you want it. He hung up. Walt set the phone back on the cradle. Outside, in his neighbor's driveway, Trent Ashford-Whitmore was loading golf clubs into the back of his Range Rover, whistling. 46 hours later, on a gray Tuesday morning in late July, the first vehicles began arriving on Maple Hollow Lane. It was 7:12. The sun was just coming up over the maple trees. The air smelled like wet grass and gasoline. Walt was on his porch in the same chair he always sat in, with a fresh cup of black coffee in his Marine Corps mug. Duke was at his feet. Walt was wearing his old dress blues, the ones he had not put on in 20 years, the ones Maggie had taken in 3 times so they would still fit him as he shrank with age. He had folded the flag the night before. It was sitting on the porch rail beside him, new rope already coiled and ready. The first truck was a red 1998 Chevy Silverado. It pulled up slowly. The driver was a man in his late 70s, wearing a Korean War veteran ball cap. He got out, walked across the lawn, and saluted Walt. "Master Sergeant," he said. "Lance Corporal Hank Whitaker, Fox Company, reporting." Walt stood up slowly. He returned the salute. "At ease, Marine." The next truck arrived 2 minutes later, then 3 more, then 6. By 7:45, the entire street was lined with vehicles. By 8:30, the front yard was filled with men. By 9:00, they had spilled out into the street, blocking it completely. The Cedar Hollow Sheriff's Department had been called by an anonymous neighbor at 8:14. Sheriff Mike Donnelly, himself a Marine, Vietnam 1969 to 1971, arrived at 8:30, saw what was happening, parked his cruiser sideways at the end of the street to block traffic, got out, and joined the formation. By 9:30, when Trent Ashford-Whitmore opened his front door in a silk bathrobe to retrieve the morning newspaper, there were exactly 417 veterans standing in the street. Most of them were Marines, but not all. There were Army veterans from Vietnam, Navy chiefs from the Cold War, Air Force veterans, Coast Guard. There were veterans of Iraq and Afghanistan, men in their 30s and 40s brought along by their fathers who had been brought along by their fathers. There were 2 charter buses from a VFW post in Kansas City. There was a 1972 Cadillac with a folded flag on the dashboard, driven by Paddy Doyle himself, who had flown from Boston to Kansas City the night before and driven the rest of the way before dawn. And not one of them was making a sound. Direct hit. Let me ask you to stop here for a moment and just picture it. 417 men, average age 68. Total years of military service in that one cul-de-sac somewhere north of 9,000, standing in absolute silence on a small-town street in Missouri because one of their own had been disrespected. Tell me, friends, when was the last time you saw something like that in the world today? Trent stood in his doorway, coffee mug in hand, and his face went the color of old paper. His wife appeared behind him. She held up her phone to film, of course, because that was what she did with everything, but her hand was shaking too badly to hold it steady. The veterans turned as a group. They looked at Trent. Nobody yelled, nobody threatened, nobody raised a hand. They just looked. Walt stepped down off his porch, slowly, with the help of Paddy Doyle's arm. He walked across his lawn, the dew soaking through his polished shoes, past 200 standing veterans who saluted him as he passed. He walked all the way to the brand-new 6-foot privacy fence that Trent's contractor had built 14 inches over the property line. He placed his hand on the fence. He looked at Trent. He said, in a voice that was loud enough to carry but soft as a prayer, "Son, this fence is on my property. You have 1 hour to take it down. After that, my friends here are going to take it down for you." Trent opened his mouth. Nothing came out. At 9:47 a.m., the first board came off the fence, by Walt's hand with a hammer Paddy Doyle handed him. By 10:30, the entire fence was a pile of cedar boards in Trent's driveway, stacked neatly. The veterans had done it together, old men with arthritic hands and young men with full sleeves of tattoos, working side by side in absolute silence. Then they raised Walt's flag. Paddy Doyle and Hank Whitaker did the honors. The flag, Maggie's hand-stitched flag, recovered from the puddle, washed and dried and folded with care, was hoisted up Walt's pole with brand-new rope. When it reached the top, 417 veterans came to attention and saluted. A bugler, somebody had brought a bugler, played to the colors. In Trent's doorway, Brittany was crying. The kids were crying. Trent was just standing there, looking like a man who had finally met a kind of power he didn't know existed. Then the news vans arrived. KOLR 10 from Springfield, KY3, then a Kansas City affiliate, By noon, it was on Twitter. By 3 p.m., it was a national story. By the time the evening news ran, the headline was the same on every channel. 400 veterans defend 87-year-old Marine from attorney neighbor. But that wasn't the end. 3 days later, a process server in a cheap suit arrived at Trent's door with a thick envelope. Inside was a civil suit filed by a Kansas City personal injury attorney who had volunteered, free of charge, the moment he heard. The suit was for $1,200,000. It listed criminal trespass, destruction of personal property, defacement of the American flag, a federal misdemeanor under 18 U.S.C. Section 700, charges referred to the U.S. Attorney's Office, intentional infliction of emotional distress, willful destruction of a memorial item, and tortious interference with quiet enjoyment of property. But more importantly, and Trent didn't know this yet, the news coverage had reached the Missouri State Bar Association. Within 72 hours, an ethics complaint had been filed against Trent Ashford-Whitmore for using his law firm's letterhead to send threatening, baseless legal demands to a private citizen. Within 10 days, his firm asked him to resign. Within 30 days, he had been formally censured by the bar. Within 90 days, the civil suit settled out of court for $847,000 plus all legal fees. Within 6 months, the Ashford-Whitmore family had put their house on the market. The day the moving truck came back to 410 Maple Hollow Lane, it was a cold morning in February of 2019. There was a thin crust of snow on the lawn. The maple trees were bare. The sky was iron gray. There were no goodbyes. No neighbors waved, no one came outside, no one even pretended not to watch from behind their curtains. Brittany sat in the front seat of the Range Rover with sunglasses on, even though it wasn't sunny. Trent loaded the last box himself. The kids were already at their grandparents' in St. Louis. As the Range Rover pulled out of the driveway for the last time, it passed Walt's house. Walt was on his porch, in his recliner, with Duke at his feet and a cup of black coffee in his Marine Corps mug. The flag, Maggie's flag, was snapping in the cold wind above him. He didn't look up. He didn't have to. 3 years passed. Trent Ashford-Whitmore, last anyone heard, was working as a contracts compliance specialist for a mid-sized firm in Phoenix. His wife divorced him in 2020. The Wharton MBA didn't matter much when your name had been on the front page of USA Today next to the words DESECRATED Veterans Flag. The house at 410 Maple Hollow Lane was bought by a young couple in the spring of 2019, Mark and Sarah Reyes. Mark was a high school football coach. Sarah was a nurse. They had a baby boy named Jacob. The first thing Mark did when he met Walt across the property line was ask if he could mow Walt's lawn for him every other weekend, no charge, just because. Walt accepted. In the summer of 2020, when little Jacob Reyes took his first steps, he took them in Walt's yard, holding onto Duke's collar. Walt cried in the house that night, the good kind. Duke passed in the fall of 2021. Walt buried him in the backyard under the oak tree next to the spot where he and Maggie used to plant tomatoes. A new dog came a few months later, a rescue, a small brown mutt with one folded ear. Walt named him Chesty after Chesty Puller, the most decorated Marine in the history of the Corps. Walt is 91 now as I tell you this story, still on the porch, still in the same recliner, still raising the flag every morning at sunrise. His son still calls every Sunday at 6. Patty Doyle passed in the spring of 2023. Walt flew to Boston for the funeral. He folded the flag himself. There are 7 names left in his leather notebook now. 7 men of the original 187 who came home from Chasen and are still walking this earth. Every single one of them knows they can call Walt at any hour of the day or night. And every single one of them knows that if they ever did, if any one of them ever needed it, Walt Brennan would call 400 more. So that's the story. Now let me leave you with this. You see, folks, in the world we live in today, it's easy to mistake quiet men for weak men. It's easy to mistake old men for harmless men. It's easy to look at an 87-year-old in slippers with a shaking hand and a faded ball cap and think, what's he going to do about it? But here's what people like Trent Ashford-Whitmore never understand. A man who has carried his friends down a mountain in 35 below cold doesn't forget what loyalty means. A man who has folded a flag over a casket 123 times doesn't forget what that flag stands for. A man who has spent 70 years writing names in a leather notebook doesn't forget that those names are real. Those men are still out there, and a single phone call can bring 400 of them to your front yard before the morning coffee gets cold. So let me tell you, plain and simple. Never mistake a quiet man for a weak man. Never mistake patience for permission. Never mistake an American flag flying in some old veteran's yard for just decoration. That flag is a promise to the men who carried it home, to the men who never made it home, and to every single one of his brothers and sisters in arms who will, without hesitation, drop everything and stand in the street if that flag is ever brought down. And for God's sake, friends, never, ever pick a fight with a Marine who has nothing left to lose but his honor. Because he will not yell, he will not threaten, he will not even raise his voice. He will just pick up the phone, and he will fold the flag, and 400 of his brothers will come. This story is inspired by real events and public court records. Names, locations, and specific details have been changed or dramatized for storytelling purposes. Any resemblance to real individuals is coincidental.